May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Given the fact of gravity, isn't it a little surprising that so many life forms grow upward? To be sure, there's a huge amount of plant and animal life that grows in the ground or underwater, but the things that you and I are familiar with grow upward in the opposite direction from the pull of gravity. People, giraffes, and trees are the obvious examples, but even snakes have rib cages that push their form up from the ground so their organs can fill out in 3 dimensions. To move around, animals need legs to lift them off the earth, even if, like a millipede, it's not very far. Getting up off the earth allows them to move around. And then there are birds and flying insects. Getting up off the ground is what allows them to move forward. And wow, speaking of birds, when they flap their wings up and down, it looks like they are pushing the air down in order for them to go up in the air. That's certainly part of it. But the amazing thing is that the downward motion of the wings moves them up only a little bit. Mostly that downward motion moves them forward. They push the air downward and thus push themselves upward a little bit. And then, because of the curved shape of the wings, that downward motion creates a vacuum in the space ahead of the wings, and they are pulled forward into that space at a much faster speed than the downward movement of the wings. Then, if you take one of those bird wings and point it up in the air and plant it on a sailboat, an astonishing thing happens. When a sailboat, particularly a modern boat that cuts through the water with almost no drag, when it sails in the direction that the wind is blowing, it goes about the speed of the wind, maybe a little slower. If the wind is blowing 10 nautical miles an hour, the boat goes in the same direction as the wind, a little less than 10 knots. But if the boat turns sideways to the wind, or even somewhat into the wind, it can go 20 knots or 30 or 40, much faster than the wind, even though it should be being pushed backward from where it's pointed. It goes into the wind much faster than the speed of the wind. Again, the wing-like shape of the sail creates a vacuum in front of the sail, pulling the boat forward much faster than the wind speed. The way birds seem to defy gravity when they fly, sailboats seem to defy the wind when they sail almost directly into it. But they're not defying it at all. In fact, they are being acted upon by the wind much more forcefully when they turn into it than when they are being pushed along in the same direction. So, what in the world am I trying to illustrate? It seems to me that giant redwood trees and millipedes and people like us in between and birds and giraffes are not defying gravity. They're not opposed to gravity. When we walk, we lean forward and start to fall because of the pull of gravity. Then we put one foot in front of us to stop ourselves from falling and move our weight onto that forward foot and then repeat the process. We don't defy gravity when we stand up. In fact, gravity is what propels us forward when we stand up and walk or run. Our bodies have been shaped by gravity. When the poet Naomi Shihab Nye, the author of The Middle Reading, looks at life and sees sorrow everywhere, her response is not defiant. It is because she has been shaped by sorrow that only kindness makes sense anymore. This is a mystery, dear friends, but it is not the defiance of God's creation. It is not the dismantling of God's creation. This is a mystery because we could respond in a different way. We could respond to sorrow with cynicism, anger, and selfishness. But by grace, it is completely consistent with the creation of the God of love for us to be shaped by sorrow into kindness. That's why I don't think Jesus' disciple Thomas was being faithless when he asked to see Jesus' wounds. He did not say, unless I see him do something supernatural, like come into this room even though the door is locked, unless I see something supernatural, I won't believe he's risen from the dead. He didn't say that. Instead, he said, unless I see the signs of his human suffering, I won't believe it's really him. Granted, the writer of John's gospel put scolding words in Jesus's mouth directed at the readers, warning them to be faithful. But the story of Thomas is the story of a person whose faith is shaped by loss and suffering. And so he responds when he sees the risen Jesus and sees those wounds. He responds with joy and recognition and says, "My Lord and my God." This is a mystery, and it is good news. In this moment, we see Thomas experience a new birth, just as described in the first of the three readings, a birth into hope. That first reading goes on, there is cause for rejoicing here, even though you may for a time have to suffer the distress of many trials. I'm operating on the assumption that we, like the disciples, have many trials ahead of us. We celebrated Easter last week, but it doesn't feel like a season of rebirth just yet. We could have celebrated Easter defiantly, gathering close to each other in a large group and flying in the face of the nature of the coronavirus. But instead, we celebrated Easter apart from each other physically in our own homes. We celebrate Easter by hearing the call to kindness, which is expressed by doing what is best for others, even when it feels like cutting ourselves off from life. Isolation feels a lot like being cut off from life. And indeed, some of us are cut off from making a living. We have a lot of trials ahead of us. But look at us. We are not cut off from life. Here we are, gathered together in heart and spirit and goodwill. It is our joy to offer help in the ways we can and to celebrate the help that others are able to provide when we can't. It doesn't feel like Easter. In fact, it feels like Lent is a long way from over. Yet even now, our lives are being shaped by this present time of suffering into new life, into kindness, into joy. Thomas knew that if Jesus was alive after being crucified and killed, his risen body would be shaped by his suffering. And Thomas was able to see that the Lord is risen, and by his scars, the Lord shows us that we too are reborn into new life. The Lord is risen indeed. Thanks be to God. Amen.